All right, quick look at our agenda today. We're going to look at what is continuous integration, continuous delivery, why test automation is needed during it, and then how SmartBear and ReadyAPI fit in. Quick introduction to SmartBear. SmartBear is a Boston-based company. We have over 11 offices globally, and we focus on creating solutions for development, testing, and operations teams to help them instill quality throughout the entire development lifecycle. We were founded about a decade ago and continue to innovate with open source projects like Swagger and Soap UI, as well as in-house innovation with Load Ninja, which is a performance testing tool for web that we launched about 2 months ago, as well as acquisitions this year with HipTest and Zephyr, 2 test management platforms that are new to our portfolio. You also notice that we have a new look. We've actually recently rebranded in the last month as well. You can take a look on the web in the next few weeks to actually see that in full, I guess, design. But for now, you'll see all the updated stuff on our decks. And let's talk a little bit about our portfolio in totality. On the left-hand side here on our y-axis, we look at the UI and the API layer. And on the top, our x-axis, we're moving throughout the SDLC from the development cycle, test through ops. Today's webinar will be focused on the bottom portion here, which is our API lifecycle products, Swagger Hub, Service V Pro, Soap UI Pro, and Load UI Pro. As well as a little bit of AlertSite, which is an API monitoring tool. Also, real quick housekeeping. Today's webinar will be recorded. We'll hopefully have some audio to it as well, and we'll send that around probably in about 48 hours after we get a cut through. And any unanswered questions at the end of today will also be answered during that. If you have questions, please ask them in the Q&A forum. Not in the chat if you're available in the chat. It's a lot easier to track in QA. All right, so real quick, what is CICD? CICD stands for continuous integration and continuous delivery. It's a process of continuous integrating your code into a master repository. So you avoid things like monster merge, and you can actually track changes. So continuous integration is that first part, and that's just the part that tells us to work our code into that main branch of a repository. Again, we're avoiding the master merge. And at each point of integration, so each small change we make to our code base and we integrate into that repo, we're going to package, build, and test our entire application flow there. So if we find any bugs, if we find any problems, we're going to get faster feedback. This should be continuous delivery, really. Continuous delivery is actually the process of deploying and actually bringing the feature or that branch to production and bringing it to the customer. So you're actually not just taking your code and putting it into a master repo, which we'll talk about, that can be done on even a waterfall team that might not release in a quick, or let's say an Agile team that is not releasing on a 2-week interval, but maybe a 2-month or 3-month interval. We can still constantly integrate our code into our main branch and get the value of CI/CD. Continuous deployment is taking that to the next level. Quite honestly, we see only our most advanced customers that compete in areas where technology and quite honestly, defects are not a huge issue. So things like Etsy, Netflix, they're famous for their continuous deployments. But when you look at that compared to, let's say, a bank or a medical device company, their stakes are a lot lower with each release. So we'll talk about that as well a little bit. Just to cover the differences graphically, this top portion is what continuous integration is. So we're checking in our code, we're building actually and packaging up our service or application. We're running unit tests against it, integration tests, end-to-end load tests. This is all happening in the integration phase. So again, none of this actually has to get to production. None of it has to be seen by the customer, but we're not waiting weeks or months to check in large snippets of code. They're actually going to be maybe half a feature, a couple hours work during the day. When you feel like you get to a spot, stop, check in, and then maybe build some tests around that code after your check-in and you see the regression, or fix if a bug does come up. Next down in the middle here is continuous delivery. This involves the same process before, but we're actually, with continuous delivery, going to have the means to get to production. It's not going to be in an automated fashion, but it is going to actually involve the process of getting our code that was checked in and integrated, built and tested. Now we're actually going to have a process to release. And this, the difference between continuous delivery and continuous deployment, not only one is reality, right? Continuous delivery is going to be the major one here, but there might be a manual check. This might be where Jenkins kicks off a Jira ticket or an email to a vice president of engineering to check the build, to check the artifact themselves, and then maybe he or she will give it a green light, and then that piece of software will actually get deployed to production. But there might be some manual checks and reviews happening at the end before release. And as we talked about, continuous deployment is actually removing that manual barrier and having a completely automated system where each time you check in code, each time you actually make a change to the code and you go to integrate, that is production ready code. Those are production ready changes. They're going to go through a vast complex set of tests and checks and checks and actually see whether that change will affect the production build, but that's going to go and slide out to production automatically. So there's no real maybe manual review here. Everything can be automated in our build, test, and deployment process. CICD is perfect for Agile. Agile isn't a deployment methodology. That's where we see a lot of DevOps come in. It's really the technical implementation of the Agile process philosophy. So Agile is that process behind it. But it does have a ton of overlap here. It involves iterating often. It needs and requires to get feedback earlier. And it also requires you to automate as much as possible. So continuous integration, continuous delivery, these two things really help out here. They have the same exact objectives as the Agile process. They go hand in hand. After, again, a couple days work, after maybe a sprint, checking in everyone's code, having this automated process, this is a huge win for finding bugs and shifting left. So why is test automation needed in this process? The big factor here is speed. And when we say continuous, that definitely comes with some idea of speed, right? The CI/CD process does not technically solve speed. Actually, there's a lot of things that inhibit speed here, a lot of steps that are consistently happening. And if your testing is still largely done by manual work, then you're going to waste your entire CI/CD pipeline. You're going to lose a lot of the benefits of iterating often, getting feedback earlier. And QA is going to feel constantly overworked if there's a backlog of checked-in code where there's a manual piece in this manual link in this process that needs to be done. By automating our tests, we cut out drastic testing time, and we're able to reasonably integrate code with full test coverage and, again, a continuous process that feels speedy. Maybe our first build time is in an hour. But we can really get that down to just minutes with best practices, running our test in parallel, and automating more at the service layer rather than the UI layer. Just some other quick automation benefits to always keep in mind are faster development cycles. We're actually going to reduce the time spent in the testing phase. It's going to become part of the workflow and not a bottleneck. We're also going to increase test coverage by building testing and automating at the entire pipeline. We'll really cut down And we'll cut down on test time, and we'll be able to test more because of it. And also the last thing is the same thing we talked about with Agile. It's wildly important in the CI/CD to get instant feedback back to developers so they can make changes and go forward with their own code. All right, so let's look at some of the CI/CD tools and what a CI/CD server is that helps us do things. And of course, we're going to start with the most famous one, and this is Jenkins. So Jenkins is the star of today's show as well. It's actually used to be called Hudson. It was conceived inside the walls of Sun Microsystems before they were actually bought by Oracle. Once Oracle purchased Sun, the fighting ensued, and the community wanted Hudson to be open sourced, but Oracle did not want to do that. So I believe they went to court over it in 2011. They settled, and finally Jenkins is an official fork of the Hudson project. Hudson has about, I think, I want to say it was like 16 contributors and really low count. And obviously Jenkins is wildly popular around the world. There's thousands of plugins. It gets rated consistently wildly high on GitHub. It's just an overall awesome project with an awesome community. And you'll see the logo here. It's actually a butler, and that's because Jenkins automate tasks for us. Jenkins actually doesn't have any power to do any of the build or testing, but what it can do is it can start projects, and it's this tremendous framework, again, built on plugins that can help you start the build process with different tools, start testing suites, look into a Git repository on a regular basis to make changes, again, on an automated fashion. But it's just this tremendous automation framework that's very extensible. And again, it's open source, so we're not paying for anything here except for the task that it's carrying out. A quick note for some other tools that we'll actually not be going over, but Jenkins is definitely not the only fish in the sea. A lot of these CI tools are open source. Some are proprietary. A lot of them have the same principles. They're all going to help us automate tasks throughout the delivery pipeline. Some are cloud-based. Again, some do things on a different flavor here, but just to go over these ones, we have CodeShip. We have Team City by JetBrains, Circle CI, which is becoming more popular at the enterprise with a cloud offering. Go by ThoughtWorks, I believe, makes Go. Yep. Bamboo by Atlassian, and then Travis CI. And again, these are just some of the more popular ones. There's basically hundreds of CI tools out there and frameworks. We, as ReadyAPI, work with a lot of them because of our command line integrations. So you can just run a command line step in many of these as a build step in your pipeline, and we work out of the box with that. So this is what a Jenkins project really looks like. It's built on this. This is the first kind of wave of Jenkins. We'll look at an updated version called Blue Ocean. But Freestyle Project is a great way to start out. It's easy to go in and add multiple steps in there with different plugins. And this is really why it's so great, is because it's so open and because there's so much activity behind it. Blue Ocean versus Classic. This is the new Jenkins UI. And it has a visual pipeline editor, which picture looks a little wonky. I have a better picture on the next slide. But you can see it's a little bit clearer as you step through and you do get to actually graphically see your pipeline in action. And it's also great that for a tool that's been around for a while, it's constantly getting upgrades. This is an example right here of ReadyAPI and a cleaner look at a pipeline you might have. You'll see on the left, we'll start the build. And we'll run some tests, some functional tests first with ReadyAPI, SOAP UI Pro. Then we'll run performance tests with Load UI Pro. And we can run security tests after that with SOAP UI Pro again. And then after that, we actually can virtualize the asset, we can run those tests again, but all of this can happen in our delivery pipeline. This is a prettier graphic version of the previous slide, but it also includes Swagger Hub. And all of this can be automated. All of these tools you'll see have native integrations with not only Git and GitHub, but also Jenkins and a lot of other CI tools. But Swagger Hub on the left is our collaboration platform for working on the Swagger, on the open API spec with Swagger tools in the cloud. And let's say we make a change to our API code. We can save that there and automatically push it to Git. And our Jenkins CI server can consistently look for changes made to that Git repo. Once it finds something, it's going to start automating its tasks. First, it might run a library of unit tests against that code. Then it might package up and build. So in this instance, we're going to actually deploy a virtualized service on a container. So we have a Docker container using Virt Server and Service vPro. We're going to be able to virtualize an API and actually deploy it just as if it was had realistic data behind it. Then we're going to be able to run our API layer tests against that service using SOAP UI and Load UI Pro. And once those API tests pass, we'll move on to the UI layer. If those API tests fail, that'll be the quickest part of our testing, and we'll be able to get instant feedback. There's no reason to go to UI testing until the API layer passes. After that, we can continue to use some really neat SmartBear tools like cross-browser testing to run automated Selenium tests against the full service with the UI. And then we can monitor this application in the wild with AlertSite, our synthetic monitoring tool. We can do that not only at the UI level, but also at the API level to really get performance statistics while the tool is being used. All right, so right now I'm going to turn it over to Jess. She's going to walk us through ReadyAPI and what it's like in a CI/CD pipeline and how we can use it. So let me share real quick.
Thanks, Dan. Perfect. So I'm actually sharing my screen. But before I get started, hello, everyone. This is Jayesh. I work here as a sales engineer for the API tools. So Swagger Platform and ReadyAPI Platform are the two tools that I cover. For today's session, we'll actually I'll just go over a brief overview for ReadyAPI and which out of all the tools, actually everything can be automated from here. So if you have a SOAP UI test suite test case, you can automate that outside of ReadyAPI. If you have a secure or load test or service virtualization service that you would like to run directly from the command line, you can also do that. So before we actually get started, I'm just going to give you a quick overview on SOAP UI, on ReadyAPI Platform, what each tool does. And then we can go over a scenario which I'll try to automate. Okay. So this is ReadyAPI Platform. It's a desktop tool. You can directly download it on Windows, Linux, or Mac. So all of the tests that we run can pretty much run on Windows, Linux, or Mac. So if you're creating a project on Windows, you can still run the same project on Linux or Mac. The platform itself consists of 4 tools. So there is SOAP UI Pro, there is Secure Pro, then Load UI Pro, and Service Virtualization. So SOAP UI Pro is mainly functional testing. So this is where you will build your scripts for functional testing your APIs. You can check how accurate your responses are against the test requests that you send and the responses that you received. You can add validations for those. You can also go in and send values back and forth. So build a workflow for your API calls. So something like login, search, by, logout, where you can have a chained workflow built inside of a test case. You can also go ahead and do a data-driven test. So if you have like an Excel file or a CSV file, and pretty much import the data from a database as well. So any database which has a JDBC driver can connect and communicate with this, with ReadyAPI Platform. Then there is a reporting functionality. So anytime you automate your tests across ReadyAPI, we actually provide 2 popularly used reports across. So one is JUnit reports, which is also the industry standard. So across SOAP UI Pro, Load UI Pro, and Secure Pro, you can generate JUnit reports. You can also go ahead and generate PDF reports. So if you just want a summary of what tests you ran, this can help you to just generate a PDF report. Besides this, you can also do automation. Secure Pro, on the other hand, so SOAP and Secure go bundled in together. So if you have access to the functional testing, you also have access to the secure testing piece. Under Security Pro, we actually provide some pre-built scans, which you can directly apply to your APIs, whether it's a SOAP or a REST API. There are pre-built scans for HTTP method fuzzing, cross-site scripting, SQL injection, boundary scan, authentication scans that you can apply. The main benefit is, again, just to make sure that your APIs are secured as well and not just functionally accurate. Then there is Load UI Pro. As the name suggests, it's mainly for checking how your API performs once you scale your tests against the API. So the main benefit here is you can convert any functional test to a load test. So if you have a scenario where you're essentially providing a data-driven test or an end-to-end workflow for your API, so chaining test steps like login, search by, logout, where a session ID or an authentication token is maintained, you can go ahead and convert that to directly a load UI test, and the session will be maintained across every virtual user that you create. Besides that, if you have thousands of rows in your data set, and if you generate 1,000 virtual users, you can make sure every virtual user accesses unique values from your request rather than sending cache requests and getting cache responses back. Then there is service virtualization. So SOAP, Secure, and Load, you're mainly a client sending out requests to your web service. On service virtualization, the main benefit here is that you can actually dispatch responses. So you're essentially a service that is hosted, and you can dispatch responses based on the incoming requests. Scenario one where Service Week can be helpful is if your API is still under development or not yet reachable. So in those scenarios, you can have your functional testing, unit testing team started and build a dummy API so you can refer it. Even your UI team can get started so that you can have faster release to the market. The other scenario where service virtualization or Service Week can be helpful is if you have a third-party API or a live API which has a rate limit, or if it goes down often or is not reachable most of the time, or is only available like few hours a day. For those scenarios, you can essentially go in and record transactions. So service virtualization has a recording capability where it can record transactions, and that way have those transactions recorded, and then you can reach out to those to that recorded dummy API. But that was an overview. And as mentioned before, every test that you create in functional testing can be automated. Similarly on Secure, similarly on Load. In service virtualization, there are multiple ways of running your services or triggering your services on the pipeline. So one of the way is using Vert server. So Service V, again, is mainly for building the services. So this is where you will build the service, you will create logic across the responses that are to be dispatched. But service virtualization works in conjunction with something called as Vert server, and Vert server helps you in scenarios where if currently when I build a service in Service V, it's only accessible locally to my machine. But if Dan or all of my team members would like to test against that service, then I can actually install it on Vert server, and that will help me to run my tests across like a server machine rather than just running it locally. So everyone can reach out to the service that I've built. Under SOAP UI Pro, it's pretty straightforward. You have a service created, you have a project created. There are multiple ways of creating a functional test. So if you have a Swagger definition, WSDL, Waddle, you can pretty much import that and get started from there. There's also an endpoint integration. So if you have a URL and the method associated to your REST API, you can get started with that. For SOAP, unfortunately, there's just WSDL. There are a bunch of integrations that you should explore. So there are integrations for different parts of the development lifecycle. So there is an integration for, let's assume that you would like to first import your APIs that you have either from an AWS server. So if you have an AWS gateway, you can directly download the plugin and import your APIs from there. Or a CADev portal, you can also import your APIs from there. We also have Swagger integration. So if you have Swagger definition or Swagger Hub portal account, you can import your APIs from there. There's REST. There's a plugin for REST APIs for Postman. So if you have collections created on Postman and you would like to do a detailed functional testing across it, you can pretty much go in and import it. But besides that, there is Git. So Git is actually directly now added across the code. So you don't have to go in and manually download the plugin, but you can directly have Git available for team testing scenarios. Then there is a Docker container. So there is a Docker image that we have uploaded on the Docker Hub. So you can directly pick up that image, and I'll show you how you can generate command line from the test runner. But the logic on the Docker container is exactly the same. You pretty much use the command line license manager and the command line tool generator or the load test tool generator, and then you can run your tests against that. So Docker, currently the image that we have is only for SOAP UI Pro tests. So it only does for the functional tests. We also have a Jenkins plugin, which you can use. But on Jenkins, there are actually 3 options. So there is test runner as one of the options where you can use a test runner batch or a test runner shell file and run your tests across those. There is Maven plugin, which is another option where you can run your tests via Maven. The other option is if you have a master slave setup, you can generate dynamic slaves using Docker and trigger your tests across those. So those are the options. For the tests, just a quick heads up on how you can build a project so that it's easier to manage your tests across. So the first that I'm actually going to go over is something called as tagging. So there are 2 ways to group your tests. One is based on test suites and test cases. So for example, if I have 5 scenarios, and if those 5 scenarios, I can group them so that for a test case A, test case B, test case C, if they're part of the scenario 1, I can group them under test suite 1. If there is scenario 2, and there are certain groups of tests that are going to be part of it, you can group them based on test suites. So that way, once you trigger this on CI/CD pipeline, and if you've grouped all of your tests that you want to run together in individual test suites, you can that way trigger test suite 1, test suite 2, test suite 3, depending on your requirements on which release has happened. The other benefit of using the UI and setting up the test in a certain way is there are 2 types of runs on test suite level as well as on the project level. So if you're on the project, there is sequential run and there is a parallel run. So sequential run can be really helpful in scenarios where I have 5 test suites, but all are independent of each other. So it does not really matter that I don't need to stop for scenario A to finish so that I can run scenario 2. So depending on your use case, you can do the settings here. If you have test suites, if you have a test suite which consists of test cases, and if those are independent too, then you can pretty much go in and add test cases which can run in parallel if they're not dependent on each other. So those are the 2 things which you can decide in the automation beforehand. The other main benefit of using ReadyAPI is you can always group within test suites and test cases, but there is also an option within the tool for tagging. So if you have a scenario where there are a bunch of tests which are regression, and some of the tests are new tests, and depending on a certain condition on your pipeline, if you would just like to run regression suite, or if you just like to run new test tags, you can also use the tagging functionality. which can help you to group your tests further. So for the tagging part, on the UI, it's just essentially helpful for scenarios where I can just use new tests and I can filter through the new test tags, or if I want to run both. So it just helps in visually. But on automation, and we'll go over when we generate command line on how this can be helpful. So in here, you can pretty much just go in and tag test cases. So, and the way to tag is you highlight the test case or the test suite. So tagging is available on both levels. So there is test suite tags, and then there are test cases tags. So I can actually go in and select a tag depending on my use case, and have it available across here. Or you can also create new tags. So that's the tagging functionality. The next functionality, which is pretty useful across the platform. So whether it's you're using SOAP UI Pro, Secure, or Load UI, which is called as environments. So environments is something that is helpful for a couple of reasons. One is reusing your test suites test cases across different endpoints, so that you don't have to create duplicate test suites or duplicate test cases just because you wanted to run it against dev or QA staging. Besides this environment feature manages something like, let's assume if I have a scenario where in this project, I have a database test step, and I have configured this template that I'm going to use across. So let's assume I have a JDBC request test step in here. So I can pretty much go and add a database test case here. Let me actually change it to staging. Yep. Sorry about that. I'm going to redo it. All right. So let's assume that I have a connection template created here. And I have a JDBC request test step. And this probably I'm using this test step multiple times across. So once you run it. So now when I'm in default environment, it's actually picking up the environment and the endpoint from the default environment. So you can see I'm actually using the default environment's endpoint. But the main benefit with environments is it just does not control your endpoint, which is the service that you're using, but it actually helps you to generate unique connections and have unique custom properties across each environment. So that means when I'm under the dev environment, I can use this connection string. If for some reason I have a separate login for the dev environment and I don't use the same database, or if I'm using a totally different database from what I'm using for default or the QA environment, you can also go in and reconfigure the connection. And what this helps essentially with on automation is if I change this to dev, my endpoint changes to dev, but my connection string will also move to the dev environment login. And this is currently this environment. I don't have a user in Postgres with dev environment, so it's not going to work. But this is the main benefit that you can actually have with environments and automation. You can essentially manage not just the endpoint, but you can also manage individual logins for your databases, or even if you have different files across for your databases or for your data sources, if you have a data-driven test where let's assume you actually import a data in ReadyAPI, and then you essentially go in and pass the values from the request and map it to the request test step wherever you're sending it, and then you're actually looping over it. So in those scenarios, let's assume that for a dev environment, I have a file which is unique to that environment, and for QA, I have something totally different. So you can also parameterize this. So I can actually go in environments and create a parameter which could be called as a file name. So let's assume. And then I can just add the file name here. So when I'm in my dev environment, I'll be using this file name. And when I'm in the staging, I'll be using this specific file name. And then all I need to do in my data source is just, instead of hard coding this, I can go in and so we have something called as point and click, which essentially just goes in and gets you the expansion. So I can pretty much just go in and fetch this. So instead of hard coding city XLSX, I'm actually sending this. And now if I run this, it's not going to work because there is no file called a staging right now. And that's why it didn't work. But you can pretty much use the environment functionality for dynamically getting values across. So that's essentially how you can use environments so that you can not just have unique endpoints, but you can also have unique file names. You can have unique database connection strings across. So that's one of the key benefits. Besides this, anytime you're running your project in ReadyAPI, there are two formats of projects by default. So there is one which is flat XML file, which can be really helpful for scenarios where you're the only person who is testing, or you have two team members, but you each, both of them work on individual projects. If you have scenarios where you are actually team testing, where you import scenarios from, or you work together on the same project, you can have something called as Composite Project. So all you need to do for Composite Project is set this to true. And then once you set it to true, now it'll be stored as a folder. So now on automation, when I have every test suite will be a unique folder, every test case will be a flat XML file. So you can actually make sure that every, if you as a tester is working on test suite 1, test case 1, you won't be overwriting the changes from some other user who is on test case 2. So every test case will be a flat XML file so that you won't be overwriting each other's changes, or you can actually at least reduce the merge conflicts that way. Besides this, once you are in a composite project format, you can pretty much do a git init on that directory and either put in the SSH or HTTPS for your Git repository URL. We have a Git integration, so even if you're using GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, so any repository which essentially supports Git, we can support that. Same exact logic with Security Pro. Under the installation, so the way the automation works on each is, I'm actually going to go over the installation directory. And again, I'm on Windows machines, so that's why I have test runner batch. But if you're using Linux or Mac, you can pretty much use test runner shell. The command line, whichever you generate from the tool, from ReadyAPI platform itself, is pretty much applicable for Linux machine as well as Mac machine. So there is no difference in the command line. The only thing that changes is the test runner. Instead of test runner batch, you'll be using test runner shell. Same exact logic with security test runner. So security test runner is used to run your security tests. And then there is load UI test runner. So load test runner is pretty much referred to run your tests for load UI outside of ReadyAPI. The utility that we provide within the tool just helps you to generate the command line so that you don't spend a lot of time creating arguments. There is documentation online. So if you have a scenario where you would like to refer what -e or what -s does, you can pretty much go in and get the documentation for that and refer it directly. But the utility itself is really helpful for just generating and kickstarting your project for automation. So this is launch test runner. This is where you can provide which test suite test case you want to trigger. So you can trigger based on that if you have tags. So in this project, there are no tags. The other one had tags, but you can pretty much go in and trigger which test suite test case you want to create your test against. You can save your project before run. You can pretty much go in and decide which environment you would like to run against. And you can also store reports. So the JUnit reports that I mentioned are pretty much, you can generate those. You can also generate combination of both. So you can have PDF reports and then also JUnit reports here. So you can generate both in the scenario. You can provide a folder which is accessible so that it's you can generate reports post run. We also have a Slack integration. So if you guys have Slack channel, you can pretty much provide your access token and authentication token. So create a channel, add the tokens here, add the user's token where whoever you want to post it, or you can post the channel's token ID and then have it created here. If you want to post it like on individual users and a channel, you can just add a comma against those token and have those available here. Then there is tags functionality, which is, so you can either use test suite test case or you can use tags. And what this does, it pretty much just builds the command line. Now, once you have this command line created, you can literally just copy paste it on Windows command line or terminal and have it run. You can also parameterize it. So if you have scenarios where you, instead of dev, you would like to put in staging or QA, you can pretty much do that. If you want to change the report format, or if you want to change the directory where the report is stored, you can pretty much do that. The main question, the common question that I come across is when you run a composite project, you give path to your folder. So this is like the folder path. When you run a flat XML file project, you give the path to the XML file. So this time I'm running composite, so it actually gives me the path to the folder structure itself. The same exact logic with security test runner. So if you have security tests created across here, you can pretty much just use this launch security test runner. You can go ahead and also use dev QA staging. You can go ahead and create security issues report and generate PDF. So same exact logic, this generates the command line. On load UI test runner, the only difference here is that on load UI test, you can pretty much go in and also generate a command line for distribution. So if you have scenarios where you would like to distribute your tests across different machines, when you generate this load UI launch test runner, you can select the, you can pretty much provide the path here. And in here on the overrides, you can actually provide the agent's IPs so that you can have those run from here. So that's the only setting which is different from regular security test runner. In here, you can also go ahead and add, you can override the arriving base views. You can go ahead and add specific agents across to distribute your tests. But other than that, the reporting, the folder and everything is exactly the same. So some questions. So there's a question asked that can SoapUI Pro work on Azure REST services testing? Yes. I believe we recently, there was a feature request, or I think we have already added it. But yeah, we also have like OAuth 2, which is very specific to Azure. So we do work on those Azure REST service testing. Is ReadyAPI a free tool? Can I use ReadyAPI is with just SoapUI Pro and Secure Pro only? So if you have SoapUI Pro and Secure Pro license, you can go ahead and use it. ReadyAPI itself requires at least one tools platform license. Then there's another question, which is, do you have a UI to build your Groovy scripts on SoapUI Pro? So we do have an editor which you can run, but actually we can post, hey, do you have the link to Groovy webinar? And if you can,
yeah, we can put it in the,
yeah, we can put it on the
appendix
chat.
When we send this out.
So Groovy webinar is way more detailed. We can also follow up with the email. Then there is another question asked to do CI without explicitly opening SmartBear UI component, but trigger them command line including. Yes, so you can also go ahead. So if you don't wish to use run tests, so once the test scripts are built here, you can pretty much go in on Jenkins machine, and you can either download our plugin, which is you can pretty much go in and into the Jenkins plugin section and download it. But all you pretty much do here is if you're using Windows Batch or Shell, you can select that. And you provide the path to the bin directory, and then you just provide the path to the test.
Yeah, could you run that now?
Yep.
Just in the terminal? Can you run that in the terminal?
Yeah. I'm going to build it now. And then you can go ahead and go in the console log.
What about the Windows terminal?
Yeah, I can also do that.
Yeah, yeah, I guess it's going to output the same stuff.
Yeah,
This is what it looks like.
this is the console output. So
Right.
it pretty much, no matter where you run our tests, if you're running from the command line, it runs exactly the same way, whether it's getting triggered from the Docker or from Jenkins or any CI/CD tool. It pretty much first fetches all of our required libraries to get started. Then it fetches the license, and then it triggers the project test suite test case that you have added here. And then you can see in detail, like running REST test case 1, test step, a specific test step that you've triggered, and it checks. It can also generate a report. So you can also refer that report here. By default, under our reports, you can always see the raw request, raw response. So anytime there's a failure, all of those test results are actually reported. There are a lot of questions coming in.
Yeah. Can you show an example of calling SOAP UI from Jenkins, which we pretty much just did that?
Yes. So this is calling SOAP UI from Jenkins. So in the configure, this is where you've called the test runner. So when you call SOAP UI also has a test runner batch or test runner shell, SOAP UI open source. But the only difference is that you can essentially run just the non-pro test suite test cases from open source. And here you can run all the pro features, which is environments is included on the pro. Can ReadyAPI integrate Selenium tests built on Maven and Test PJ? So we can integrate with Selenium. So there's an article for that. I can see if I can search for it. But we can also integrate with Maven. So ReadyAPI has a Maven plugin itself. So once you install your Maven plugin, it has a POM file. So you pretty much go in and specify the version that you're using. This pretty much takes whatever the parameters the command line takes, which is the report format, the project that you're running, the test suite test case. So there are XML tags that are created for specific tests that you're triggering. So you can pretty much run your tests in Maven as well.
All right, I think this is going to be the last question here. SOAP UI Pro, does it work with mocks and micro web services?
So yes. So we can work with any microservice which has a valid REST or a valid SOAP request. We can send out a request to that.
Even a messaging service.
Even JMS messaging is supported.
Yeah. And then on the mock side, we can mock ourselves. We can virtualize with Service Fee Pro, or if you use another mocking tool or mocking framework, we can still hit that as well.
Yep.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for attending as well. We'll send out a little appendix on the deck, but you should get that in the next 48 hours. Enjoy the rest of the day, and thank you.